Howdy, Pima Aztecs. Welcome to my favorite chapters on immunity, because it's all about the cells. You gotta understand what the cells are doing. You have to learn the names of the cells in immunity. You have to learn what they secrete, what they can bind, and how they talk to each other. So it's all about the cells. You should maybe make lists of the cells, what they secrete, and what they can bind to, so you don't get them confused, because a lot of students will tell me that the cell's name is actually what they secrete. So get on board with that. Here we go, chapter 15. So this is a diagram of immunity, just sort of a broad overview. So you have this purple box here, innate defenses. Those are also called non-specific defenses. And within the innate, aka non-specific lines of defense, there's a first line of defense and a second line of defense. Down here in the green box, you have adaptive defenses. Those are also called specific defenses. And the adaptive or specific defenses are your third line of defense. So you have three lines of defense against those microbes that are trying to destroy you. So thanks, Mother Nature, and thanks for making it so complicated too. So chapter 15, we're only going to be talking about innate defenses, but we will be talking about the first line of defense and the second line of defense. So this video is just the first. We'll talk about the first line of defense, and then the next two videos for chapter 15, we'll talk about the second line of defense. So the first line of defense includes all your surface barriers. So that would include external or physical barriers like your skin and your mucous membranes. So like the mucous membranes in your oral cavity or your nasal cavity. And then, so that's the first line of defense. And then within the innate or non-specific immune system, the second line of defense includes all these internal defenses. So, for example, phagocytes, one of my favorite cells, because back in the 90s when I was getting my PhD, my boss loved the macrophage, which is a certain type of phagocyte. So I worked with those a lot. I like these guys, natural born killer cells. They're part of the second line of defense. The process of inflammation, and everybody's probably heard that, and you've probably have had an inflammatory event in your life. Inflammation is part of your second line of defense against microbes. You might just think it's annoying, but it's there for a reason in terms of microbial defense. Also within the second line of defense, you have these antimicrobial proteins, and those would be considered as chemical barriers. And then this, what about this guy? Fever. So when you get a fever, temperature goes up, what happens is bacteria don't like to replicate or divide when it's hot. So your fever is actually a really cool defense to get the bacteria to stop them from making more of themselves. So, for example, this could be a little tricky. The skin is a physical barrier, but then the salt, sodium chloride, NaCl, on your skin is a chemical barrier, because salt is technically a chemical. And then chapter 16, we'll talk about the adaptive defenses. But adaptive or specific defenses, that's your third line of defense, include humoral immunity, and the major player in humoral immunity is B cells. And then cellular immunity, the major player is T cells, or R T cells, I should say. All right, let's take a look at an overview of the body's defenses. So this is a cartoon that shows probably what you learned in Bio 202. So this top part of the cartoon, this is a mucous membrane. So this is the lamina propria, or the connective tissue that the epithelial cells sit on. And here's a goblet cell, and all these white things in it, that's all mucus that gets secreted onto the mucous membrane. Mucous membranes, does a cutout of your transverse colon here to show a mucous membrane, but you also have mucous membranes in your nasal cavity. You know that. Second type of membrane that would be part of your membrane defense would be these serous membranes. These are actually internal membranes, but you have this areolar tissue, which is like a loose connective tissue, and then you have these thin epithelial cells that make the serous fluid called the transudate here. And then you have a cutaneous membrane, that's your skin. So you have the dense irregular connective tissue, you've got some areolar connective tissue, and then you have the layers of epithelial cells with the epidermis on top where the dead keratinocytes are. So those are all barriers to microbes trying to get into your body. So in general, at birth, you have three main lines of defense present for you. The first two lines of defense are innate or nonspecific. The third line of defense is adaptive, also called specific. The innate or nonspecific immune system uses physical barriers against pathogens. So if your skin is intact, that's a good physical barrier. Your mucous membranes, including mucous membranes in your urinary tract, your respiratory system, and your digestive system. All those mucous membranes, the mucus can trap microbes, and then the microbes can be destroyed through various techniques. The innate immune system, innate or nonspecific immune system, also uses cells. This is my shorthand for macrophages. They use chemicals, we talked about that. An example would be complement or the salt on your skin. The innate immune system also uses protective processes that will inactivate invaders or kill the invaders, like inflammation. Innate immune system also uses things like bile and digestive enzymes, hydrochloric acid in the stomach, and other chemicals in the GI tract to ward off the bacterial invasion. Then we talked about this, the third line of defense is the adaptive or specific immune system. And adaptive, it's called specific because the adaptive immune cells, the B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes, specifically recognize pathogens that come into your body. Whereas for example, the macrophages of the non-specific immune system will non-specifically recognize bacteria. The B and T lymphocytes will specifically recognize bacteria. And we'll talk more about that when we do the adaptive immune system. So let's think of an interesting question. You consume contaminated romaine lettuce from Yuma, Arizona. Way to go, Yuma. I taught high school there for 4 years. So, which chemical barrier attempted to prevent you from an infection? So it says you consumed it. That means you ate it, went into your stomach. The chemical is hydrochloric acid in your stomach. The hydrochloric acid is attempting to destroy the contaminants, the bacteria that was on the romaine lettuce from Yuma, Arizona. So we're just continuing an overview of the body's defenses. So I like this cartoon. Check it out. Here's your host cell. So that could be a cell in your body. And here's the dreaded bacterial cell. And look at all this stuff it's got sticking off of it. It's got these fimbriae. So these guys right here, these fimbriae. It's got adhesins. So these fimbriae and adhesins and other sticky molecules can allow the bacteria to stick to a receptor on your host cell. So for example, I think this orange molecule on the bacteria will stick to this orange receptor on your host cell. And then this, I think that's red adhesion or sticky molecule on the bacterial cell will stick to the red receptor on your host cell. And that's how bacterial cells, well, they don't stick to things that are red and orange. This is just a cartoon. But they do stick to your host cell because of this adhesion receptor interaction. So bacterial cells will only stick to host cells if they can perform this interaction between adhesion molecules and receptor molecules. Now, if this is a host cell that doesn't have receptors that the adhesins on the bacteria can recognize, this host cell could be the cell of a member of a species that's resistant to a pathogen. So we, as humans, we have this thing called species resistance to most pathogens. So remember, our species, genus and species, we're Homo sapiens. And most of our cells don't have the receptors that will allow the bacteria to stick to them. So it says here, receptors for most plant and animal pathogens, so like this bacterial cell would be a pathogen, require an attachment. So the attachment we're talking about is that interaction between the adhesion on the bacteria and the receptor on the host cell. The pH or the temperature of our body, a lot of plant and animal pathogens don't like. They're incompatible, so they don't infect us. So therefore, we have this thing called species resistance. So for example, we have species resistance to tobacco mosaic virus. So it's a virus, but it doesn't recognize our cells. We have species resistance. Feline immunodeficiency syndrome virus doesn't affect us because we have species resistance to this virus that causes this disease, or syndrome, I should say. However, don't worry, there's plenty of human pathogens that we don't have species resistance to. So there's lots of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, viruses, and worms that can actually attach to our cells. Questions. Humans have species resistance. What is meant by this? So we just talked about that. So let's use this cartoon to answer the question. So here's a cell, stylized cell. Kind of looks a little cuboidal, and then it's got these microvilli, or extensions of the phospholipid bilayer, which is the plasma membrane, and then it's got these little receptors, these little green receptors here. And in the cartoon, it shows that some of these guys, T. cruzi, Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella, this virus, if they have some molecule that can react with the receptor on our cells, then they will be able to attack our cells. But if they don't, if the things that are trying to attack us, the microbes that are trying to attack us, can't bind to the receptors on our cells, they can't get in. So the answer, in many cases, humans lack the chemical receptors, so that'd be the green things in this cartoon, that are required by the pathogens, that's all these guys out here, to enter the host. That's the host cell is our cell. All right, so let's talk about the first line of defense in more detail, the skin. So if you had Bio 201, you probably saw a cartoon like this. So this top layer is the epi, so epi is on top of the epidermis, and then deep to the epidermis is the dermis. Deep to the dermis is the hypodermis. And here's the hair shaft, or the hair coming out of the epidermis. And then look at all this cool stuff that's in the dermis. So here's your hair follicle. There's microbes in your hair follicle. you have oil glands here. So those are green. Here's your blood vessels, red and blue. Here's a Pacinian corpuscle, or a deep pressure receptor. Here's a sweat gland, and it says you can have microbes in your sweat gland. So this is the sweat gland, and then this coily thing is actually the sweat duct that brings the sweat to the surface. And then there's some nerves. So this is the skin, the first line of defense, skin in innate or non-specific immunity. There's two layers, the epidermis and dermis. A lot of anatomists don't consider the hypodermis to be a layer of the skin. And within the epidermis, the dermis, there's hair follicles, glands, nerve endings, and they can all serve both physical defense, just by the thickness of the skin, and then there's chemical defense. So the epidermis, that's this part up here, this most superficial part, the cells are really tightly packed, and that's makes a physical barrier to most bacteria, fungi, and viruses. As you know, the surface is dead, so the keratinocytes at the surface are dead. They're dry, and they slough off. So when they slough off, they carry microbes attached to them. And this is a scanning electron micrograph of these skin cells at their most superficial, getting ready to slough off. This is just a cartoon of the epidermis in a little more detail. So this down here, this is all dermis. So this would all be dermis, and then this is an enlargement of the cartoon of the epidermis. And you learned all this in 201, all these stratum, or strata, I should say, strata, plural. And within the epidermis, you have these cells called dendritic cells. So these blue cells are dendritic cells. These are really important cells to learn about because they play a role not only in the innate immune system, they also play a really important role in the adaptive immune system, or the specific immune system. So these dendritic cells are phagocytes. So phagos just is Greek for to eat, so they can eat things. And what they do is they intercept invaders, but they do it non-specifically. So what that means is this dendritic cell has the ability to find a bacterial cell. Let's say a bacterial cell is right here. Find a bacterial cell non-specifically. So this dendritic cell doesn't have a specific receptor that can only identify this bacteria. This dendritic cell has a receptor called a TLR, which is a toll-like receptor, and the toll-like receptors on the dendritic cell. So now here's where you need to start thinking about what's my cell's name, what's my receptor's name. So the name of the cell is the dendritic cell. It has this thing called a toll-like receptor, and the toll-like receptor recognizes PAMPs on the bacterial cell. PAMPs stands for pathogen-associated molecular patterns. So this is a general pattern of proteins sticking out of the bacterial cell that the dendritic cell can recognize with its toll-like receptor. Okay. Some bacteria find the skin a good environment to grow on, like Staphylococcus epidermidis, but that's a resident normal bacteria. That's not pathogenic to us. Dermal cells, so it doesn't show really in this cartoon anything called a dermal cell, but there are cells in the dermis that secrete antimicrobial peptides that are considered collectively, they're chemicals, but they're antimicrobe. They're peptides, that just means they're super short proteins, but they can destroy microbes. And those include the cells, the dermal cells secrete these molecules, defensins and dermicidins. Those are chemicals that are active against gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria and fungi. There's another enzyme that these dermal cells secrete that's called lysozyme. And lysozyme can destroy the cell walls of bacteria by destroying the peptidoglycan that's in the cell walls of bacteria. So lysozyme is kind of important. It's in the skin, secreted by cells of the dermis. You also have it in your tears. Your sweat glands secrete sweat with salt. The sweat glands also secrete antimicrobial peptides. And then the sebaceous glands, which are here. So these green things, these are sebaceous glands. So sebum is an oily substance that's secreted onto the hair shaft to keep it supple. Sebaceous glands secrete sebum, but the sebum contains fatty acids. So remember, acids, if something is acidic, that means it has a low pH. So sebaceous glands secrete sebum here onto the surface of the skin that lowers the pH. That contributes to creating an inhospitable environment on the surface of the body for microbes that don't like acidic conditions. The dermis is full of collagen, which is really tough. It's hard for bacteria to get through that barrier. And then the blood vessels here in the dermis, they deliver defensive cells and chemicals to the skin. Think blood vessels. All right, let's take a look at this. This is an illustration of the upper airway wall. So upper airway, be your trachea. So here's the basement membrane that the cells sit on. Here's the cells. So there's some purple cells, blue cells, and these black dots, those are the nuclei of the cells in your upper airway wall. Here's another cell. It's got like a pink around it. But the cells of your upper airway wall include the goblet cells. So they're making mucus. So this, see this light blue stuff here? This is all supposed to be mucus. So this part in here, that's not a cell. That's all mucus made by the goblet cells. And then here's an epithelial cell. Here's a dendritic cell. We just looked at that. Dendritic cells live in the upper airway walls. And they can recognize bacteria in your upper airway with their tall-like receptors. There's immune cells in your upper airway wall. They secrete IgA, immunoglobulin A. And then these epithelial cells, the epithelium itself is called pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So ciliated, that means they have cilia. And in the upper airway wall, the cilia stroke the mucus with the trapped bacteria towards your oral cavity, and then you can swallow that mucus or spit it out. Let's look at the bullets. The epithelial cells of the mucous membranes are continuously shed. So there's stem cells down here actually, so that these epithelial cells will do their job, and then they'll die and they'll shed away, and they'll take bacteria with them, and then these stem cells will make new epithelial cells. Here's the dendritic cells. Mucous membranes cover all body cavities open to the environment. So any body cavity that you can think of that's open to the environment, there will be a mucous membrane, including your anal canal. Respiratory, urinary, digestive, reproductive tracts. Okay. So this is called, that we just went over this cartoon, upper airway wall, this is called the mucociliary escalator. We talked about this. The goblet cells secrete this sticky mucus, traps pathogens, viruses or bacteria. The ciliated epithelial cells move the mucus toward the throat, and then you can spit it out or swallow it. That's called the ciliary escalator. Probably you've all ridden on an escalator before, so you know that visual. And then the cilia are the things that are moving. The cilia moves the mucus, and then the viruses and bacteria are trapped in the mucus. And then this is just a cartoon of basically the upper airway, so the trachea and all these structures in that upper airway. Okay, there is an apparatus called the lacrimal apparatus, and it has a role in innate immunity. It produces tears and drains them away. So I saw this when you did the eye in 201. So let's take a look. So here's your lacrimal gland producing the tears with lysozyme. And remember, lysozyme destroys peptidoglycan in the cell wall of bacteria. So the tears made in the lacrimal gland containing lysozyme will move from the glands through the lacrimal gland duct across the eye, so you'll be blinking and tears will move this way into the lacrimal canal, the nasolacrimal duct, and then into the nasal cavity here. And the whole thing is called the lacrimal apparatus. And then this is just a lateral view of the lacrimal apparatus. So you can see the tears will come into the nasal cavity, and you can blow them out, or you can take them down here and swallow them, whichever you like. So the tears made in the lacrimal glands contain lysozyme. The tears mechanically flush particles from the eye, and that contributes to protecting the eyes from microbial invasion. All right, more on the first line, normal microbiota in the innate immunity. So here's a cartoon, shows the nose and throat of the upper respiratory system. Here's the eyes, the conjunctiva, the skin, the large intestine, the urinary and genital system, and the vagina in females. So normal flora, or it's also called resident flora, it's also called normal microbiota or resident microbiota. So normal or resident just means that it lives there. It's a microbe that lives there, and it doesn't hurt you, and it's actually good for you because it competes with microbes that could be potential pathogens. And that system is called microbial antagonism. So if you have normal or resident microbiota on you, those microbes will protect you by competing with potential pathogens for nutrients and space. So if the normal microbiota is sitting there, they're not doing you any harm, they're taking up space and they're using nutrients, pathogenic microbe tries to come in, there's no room for them. These normal or resident microbiota also secrete antimicrobial substances that scare off the pathogenic microbes. So this is kind of cool. This is called microbial antagonism. So our good microbes, which are our resident or normal microbes, are antagonizing potential pathogenic microbes. And then we talked about how do they do that? The resident microbes consume the nutrients, they set a pH. They can also produce vitamins for us, like biotin, pantothenic acid, folic acid, and vitamin K from the large intestine. So that's kind of cool. Thanks, normal microbes. Okay, this is structure of the respiratory epithelium. So up top here in the nasal cavity, you have a respiratory mucosa. That means it's got these goblet cells that secrete mucus. And then here in the pharynx, the oropharynx, or your throat, you have a stratified squamous epithelium. And then you go a little further down here in the trachea, you have pseudostratified ciliated columnar again. And then in the smaller diameter bronchial, so you go trachea to right and left main stem bronchi, secondary and tertiary bronchi to these little things called bronchioles. So they have a small diameter. The epithelium becomes cuboidal. It looks like this. And then you get out here and to the farthest branches of the tracheal tree, and you have these really thin cells for gas exchange. So all of the following structures in this system, in the respiratory system, help to prevent respiratory infections. So the mucus, remember that traps microbes. The mucosal membranes, in all parts of your body that are open to the environment, actually, not just respiratory. The cilia beak, and they send the trapped microbes in the mucus to your mouth. And then there are also cells in the respiratory epithelium that secrete lysozyme. So there's lots of cells that secrete lysozyme. And remember that lysozyme is an enzyme that degrades the peptidoglycan in the cell wall of bacteria. Okay, other first-line defenses include antimicrobial peptides. We've talked about this, defensins and dermacidins. Those now remember, these aren't cells, they're molecules or peptides, and they could act against a variety of potential pathogens, including gram-negative or gram-positive bacteria. Some of these defensins or dermacidins can also act against protozoa, viruses, or fungi. So in this cartoon, here's a host defense peptide. So this isn't a cell, it's just it's a peptide, but it can help protect you against microbes. So it can do immune modulation. So it's a peptide that will recruit these phagocytes, like monocytes. It will recruit B and T cell or B and T lymphocytes, polymorphonuclear cells, which be like a neutrophil. This peptide could recruit these cells to the battlefield, wherever the microbe is, and then these cells would destroy it. And it shows here enhanced bacterial clearance, so they've eaten the bacteria. Host defense peptides can also do direct killing. So these peptides can stick themselves in the bacterial cell membrane, disrupt the membrane, cause the membrane to lyse, thus killing the bacteria. Host defense peptides can get in and destroy internal targets in the bacteria. But either way, these host defense peptides can destroy bacteria. Some of these defense peptides form holes or pores in the cytoplasmic membrane. That would be like this part of the cartoon. They use these peptides will poke a hole in the cytoplasmic membrane, bacteria lyses and dies.